All right, you lot, don't forget to give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And while you're at it, give us a 5-star rating. Trust me, it really does help us out.
What is your relationship with F1? What was your experience in Formula One?
So my experience in Formula One started in 2012 at Force India as a vehicle dynamics engineer. I was quickly propelled and cast into the pit of the trackside performance engineering life, which was very much a sink or swim experience for a lifetime opportunity. I did 3 seasons there with DiResta and Perez as their performance engineers. And then I applied for a job to be Sebastian Vettel's performance engineer. I got the job, which was crazy. Got him coming off the back of 4 world championships. And then not such a great introduction to the V6 turbo hybrid era. Tough season. He left to go to Ferrari at the end of that season. So I worked with Kvyat for a year and a bit, then Verstappen from 2016 to 17. And then after that, I wanted to move back and focus on car development instead of car operation. So I was a simulator performance engineer at Red Bull until the end of last year.
So for those that don't know, what in terms of like on a day-to-day basis, what would you tend to be doing when you're working with these drivers?
So the trackside performance engineering, I think of it a little bit different than a lot of people. Like, you're making the car go as fast as possible. It's like, no, we're actually making the car go as least slow as possible, because all the performance and everything else is found in the development phase of the car. You know, the testing and everything else, and the simulator and all those other bits. But at the track, your goal is just to get as close to that as possible, or make it as least bad as possible. So the performance engineer is the guy that during sessions is looking at a lot of like overlays between drivers, looking at the performance of the car compared to where you predicted the car would be, understanding if there's anything you've missed in your preparation and identifying that, pushing that back to the factory, because you have whole factories of people helping you during race weekends and between race weekends. And then lots of, my job list was stuff like brakes performance. It was the brake balance setup, which we saw some interesting stuff in qualifying with Vries, having, you saw brake magic in Baku with Lewis, that kind of setting up those maps, differential, fuel strategy, driver performance, and then basically the performance engineer is working directly with the race engineer and the driver to get the most out of that. The race engineers mostly focus on operations, so the build specification of the car, the run plan, and then the performance engineer is feeding back the performance information, and then the race engineer will do that. So you kind of chop and change roles depending on what's going on.
But I guess a lot of that role is a very kind of human role. So you worked with Sergio and with Paul DiResta. Like, how did they compare as people to work with from a performance engineer point of view?
They were completely different. Checo's very kind of, it's different because like I moved into that and Paul was the first driver I worked with, right? Okay. So my experience with that entire thing was different because I was on the learning curve. And at that point, I was learning a lot from him and GP, who's the race engineer I worked with.
Oh yeah, because he was at Force India, wasn't he, before he went to Red Bull?
Yeah, so I worked with GP for 6 years in a row at 2 different teams.
At the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And now he's the big chief race engineer at Red Bull and Max's race engineer. But, it's like with Paul, I was learning. With Checo, I was getting comfortable and I was getting confident. And both of them are pretty similar. It's like, you help them identify where you fast or slow to your teammate. You look at, and you're learning a lot from the data. And that, like, watching live telemetry was one of the most bizarre experiences ever, because data's coming at you every minute and a half. It's constantly feeding to you as well, and you're learning to interpret those signals and read that stuff and make meaningful comments to both the race engineer to help keep him in the loop, because he's watching traffic gaps and everything else. And then, when the driver comes back in the garage, to tell him what you think of what he did. Does he need a different brake balance map for turn 5? How's that conversation? And which questions to ask him about stuff. So the race engineer would go through how's the car balance. Then I'd go through the driver and debrief them on what specific things do you have issues with? Can we use the differential anywhere? Can we use the brake balance maps anywhere to help you? And that was a lot of that. And that was a huge, insanely steep learning curve. And it was like, I didn't have a whole lot of experience doing that. I was just kind of thrown into it.
Do you remember the first time you were out in a kind of competitive session, and the pressure, I can imagine, was pretty significant, no?
Yeah. And I nearly, so one of the main responsibilities at Force India I had was fuel management for qualifying. So fuel management.
Don't want to get that wrong.
No, exactly.
Final run Q3.
And you've seen it happen. And you've seen it happen. People run out of fuel in qualifying. So qualifying fuel is an awesome game. It's like you're playing F1 manager at the end of the race and you're messing with the fuel strategy, trying to come in with nothing in the tank, right? In qualifying, your goal is to reach the end of the run when you've boxed and you're in the pit box with, the 1 liter FIA sample in a tiny, teeny margin. So we're talking a liter of fuel and then maybe 50 mil on top of that.
Enough to put in your hand.
Yeah, exactly. Literally.
Yeah.
It's a shot. It's a measure. It's a shot of fuel.
A shot of
Exactly.
Wouldn't recommend, by the way.
Yeah, don't
do that.
one Jaeger bomb of fuel.
Yeah, exactly. No, but like that's the game you play. So you're going into qualifying. Like, you've got an out lap. Say it's let's say it's Q3 in 1-time laps. You've got an out lap, a push lap, and an in lap.
Yeah.
And all throughout Q1, Q2, and at Force Indy we weren't making it into Q2 often, but you're doing 2 runs in Q1. The goal was to come in each session with the least amount of fuel because fuel is lap time. Fuel is max, fuel is lap time. It's small margins, but if you're fighting to get into the next session, sometimes that is a couple thousands, a couple hundreds. So that was the game. So Spain, 2012, my first race, which was a cursed Grand Prix.
2012 Spain was this?
Yeah, wasn't
Past the Maldonado?
Maldonado.
Yeah.
And then the Willys garage burnt down.
Yeah. So,
Oh, God, yeah.
So that was my first race.
Baptism of fire, literally.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly. So to take a step back from that, right?
That was good.
Yeah, that was, can we do that one more time?
The joke was baptism of fire. I'm taking that one. That was good.
That was good. That took me a second.
So it's qualifying, and I manage fuel with an Excel spreadsheet. So every lap, you're looking at the telemetry saying, what's the fuel used?
You literally use an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, for fuel.
So anyone at home could do it.
Yeah, exactly.
You got the...
Come on, Bill
It's
Gates.
easy.
Bill Gates powering Formula 1.
Plug your laptop into a Force India as it's driving through.
No, so
I've got Excel, it's fine.
you're managing every lap and you're monitoring and say, right, here's my out lap, here's my time lap, here's my in lap. And let's say something had happened. I got out of sync and there was more fuel in the tank than I thought, and I wasn't sure. So I was just like, dude, I'm actually lost. I don't know how much fuel is in the car right now. I think I've made an error. And so GP being cool and collected, and he'd been a performance engineer before. He's been a race engineer for several years at that point. He was like, we'll just add a full run's worth of laps. So and all that happened was we ended up finishing with a kilo of fuel, which is 0.01 seconds.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, it's not the disaster.
Better to stay on the side of safety than...
You can be 100 slower or stop on track.
Yeah.
Or not make it.
Or get disqualified.
Yeah.
So that was my first qualifying session, and it's literally squeaky, man. It's the heart rate, acceleration, and you're getting the information as they roll into the pit lane. The car stops in the pit box, and you're looking at the fuel meter reading on the car and saying, here's how much fuel is going into the car for the next lap. So it's one of those, like, it's a mini game, but it's everything or
so
nothing.
Important. Yeah.
Did that get any easier with time?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, like then qualifying is always a super intense session. You see the pressure, and there's quick turnarounds, there's changes of plans. You've got to give quick feedback to the driver in between quick turnarounds because you're trying to leave it very late to get the best track conditions. But yeah, it got easier, but it was always it was a good. It got to the point where it was a good rush. It was so much fun. But I think at Red Bull, I didn't do fuel strategy anymore. So somebody else handled that. So I was really focused on the performance of the car, looking at brake balance. Like, okay, we need to use a different brake balance shape for turn 1. You've got understeer here. Here's what we can do with the diff setting. And it got to the point where the performance, the driver, if he had capacity to think about that and tell you where he needed help and improvement, you could make very specific changes that could probably help him. And you get a good relationship to have a good dialogue with Max and with Daniel. It's like, here's what I think you should do, And you had a plan. You're practicing at P3, but you're adapting because improvements to the brake balance and the differential can make or break a qualifying session.
So interesting, man.
I
literally just could sit here all day.
But it's just nuts how much data and stuff you'll be seeing and how much goes into just literally running a car and nothing more.
It's crazy, man. You see, it's like, why do you need, so many people to run a car? It's like, well, they're damn complicated, one. And two, the margins are so fine.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it super exciting.
We take it for granted, I think, as fans.
Maybe a little bit, but like, if one person's overloaded doing a singular job, then you try to expose everybody to all of that information. That becomes potentially alienating for a casual audience as well.
Yeah.
So I guess this is one of the things you have those discussions. If people are interested in that part of that story, they lock into it. And if it's like, this is too much, can this nerd please shut up? Then they, but yeah, it's super cool. That qualifying and race fuel management were such a rush and so much fun.